And what's going on, everyone? Thanks for tuning back in. I'm Zach Davis. With me today, Dr. Don K. Preston. How are you, sir?
I'm very great. Very great. Thank you.
All right. Gavin Ortlund made some claims on preterism a while back. We're going to essentially respond to the comments that he made here on why the millennium and the 1,000-year millennium essentially is future.
Because here's the irony of full preterism. The whole appeal is, hey, let's take the timetable references at face value. Let's take this as the original hearers would have taken them. Now, we can take that very appeal and apply it to full preterism as well. Because when you get to the resurrection, the rapture, and the millennium, full preterists lapse into the same kind of excessive qualifying and hair-splitting and tortured exegesis that they decry in the futurists. Okay, they're the ones going against common sense hermeneutics on these topics. For example, Revelation 20. Revelation 20, the millennium, this is a passage Russell himself really wrestled with. And if I recall, I admire his honesty in kind of putting it out there. If I recall, he actually abandoned a total preterism on this text. But contemporary full preterists usually go basically about Revelation 20. They have to identify with something in the past. Sometimes it'll be the period between Christ's ministry and the fall of the temple, 40 years. Other times they'll date it from the fall of the temple to some future event. Sometimes the fall of Masada, that's another event toward the tail end of the first Roman-Jewish war around 72 or 73 AD. That's reported to us by Josephus. Then you have other times they'll push it into the 2nd century, into the 130s AD, another Jewish uprising against the Roman Empire. But here's the thing. Any view like that is going to rub against the whole premise of the whole power of preterist hermeneutics, which is heed the timetables, take them at face value, take them as they would have been taken by the original hearers. Can you imagine any reader of John's Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, hearing 1,000 years and then thinking it's actually 3 or 40 or 62? The number 1,000 years can be literal or symbolic. That's a legitimate discussion. But it always refers to a long period of time in the scripture. And to think of, especially when you add on the cataclysmic war with Satan depicted at the end of the millennium, it's like, where are you going to put that into 132 AD or something like this? So what I'm trying to show here is the preterist appeal to timetables and to a common sense hermeneutic is inconsistent. It only looks at the short timetables, not the long timetables. This is why Revelation 20 is such a significant text in our Bibles, because here you have this 1,000 years. What do we do with that? I like how Keith Matheson puts this in his really helpful book, Responding to Full Preterism. Quote, hyper-preterists continually argue that a generation cannot be stretched to 2,000 years or more, and yet they take the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 and compress it into a generation. Boom. What a sentence. That's well said. And so this is the irony, is that the very strength of preterism becomes its undoing when you try to make it consistent for all the texts. I think what we want to do is take all the timetables and take them seriously, the short ones and the long ones. And 1,000 years is a long time. And I think that's talking about, I'm a millennial, so I think it's talking about the church age. But whatever view you take of that, it's certainly not 2 to 3 years or 40 or 60 years. A millennium is a long period of time. So what I think that leaves us with is a more complicated New Testament eschatology. Some things are imminent. I really think we have to reckon with this. Something happens at the end, toward the end of that New Testament era.
What we want to do to begin this is really kind of define some millennial positions. So I'm going to ask the questions. I'm going to lob the softballs up, and I'm going to let you take them just for a second. So tell us about the 1,000-year millennium and what the premillennials believe on the 1,000-year millennium.
Okay. Premillennial means before the millennium. And the dispensational world says Jesus Christ in his second coming comes before the millennial reign on earth. And then you've got the postmillennialists and the amillennials. They believe the second coming of Christ occurs at the end. In other words, post-millennial.
Okay. So when we talk about amillennial and postmillennial, they currently believe that we're in the millennium now. Is that right?
Exactly. That all started way back. Somebody named Augustine, Tychonius, and what have you. But they said that the millennium began in the ministry, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. It is the Christian age, and it ends at the second coming.
Okay. So it's not a literal reign of Jesus physically on the earth from Jerusalem. Would the amillennial would say that the millennial is strictly in heaven. Is that correct? Or how would they define that kind of?
They believe that Christ rules now through the church.
Okay. So the post-millennial sees during this millennial time a progressive advance physically through the millennium to the end of time, to the second coming?
Yes, that's one way to express that. In the post-millennial world, the Christian age, just like the amillennialist says, is the millennium. At the end of the millennium, Israel as a nation is going to be saved. The majority, not every single one, but they're going to be saved. And Christ comes and establishes a literal physical new heaven and a new earth. He renovates the current physical creation so that we get new bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes.
Okay. So a literal 1,000 years for the premillennialist. 1,000 is symbolic of a large number for the amillennial and postmillennial.
Correct.
Okay. Now tell me a little bit about your position and how your position on the millennium is different from all of that. First off, if I had to ask you about a timing of the millennium, what would you tell me that the millennial is a literal 1,000? Is it a long duration of time? What would you do with that?
I would say that the millennium began with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ and ended somewhere around the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. In other words, I believe the millennium can be defined approximately, and I don't get into specific 37, 38, 39 and a half, whatever years, but it is a one generational period of time that was designated by God to bring his plan of redemption to its perfection.
Okay. So you would consummate the second coming then at AD 70.
Correct.
Okay. Ending the millennium. So everything I read in Revelation 20, you're going to have the ending of those things in and around 66 to 70 AD.
That is correct. Because,
okay.
Well, we'll get in. We could. Well, the reason for that is at the end of the millennium, and I'm currently writing a book entitled "Mystery of the Millennium Unveiled," and in the book, I adduce about 10 or 12 different reasons, actually a bunch more than that, as to why we can see that the millennium ended in the first century in direct association with the judgment of Jerusalem and the Old Covenant world.
Okay, let's hold that one. We'll get there in just a second.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this first. How can you make 1,000 years be a period of time so short? If it's not literal, if it's not long, okay, and I think that the amillennial and postmillennial would say, hey, maybe they would say that the Lord owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and that's a reference to a long period of time. A day to the Lord is 1,000 years. 1,000 years is a day. Can be a long period of time. How can you make it such a short period of time?
Well, there are many different ways to do that. And by the way, many amillennialists and many postmillennials, and you can't see my desk very well, but it's stacked this high in books of amillennial, postmillennial, dispensational people as well. But they recognize that the 1,000 years is, point number one, a symbolic period of time. Some of the most noted scholars in the world, such as G.K. Beale, admit that the symbolism may in fact not refer to quantity of time, but quality of time, and refer to a much shorter period of time. And it's easily demonstrated both from history in the rabbinic literature, as well as early church writings and scholarly literature. There was a belief that the millennium actually was only to be 40 years. That was a commonly held. It wasn't the dominant view, but it was a commonly held view among ancient rabbis that the millennium was to be 40 years.
Okay, so with this idea of the millennium being 40 years, is there any textual evidence? Is there any use in the Bible of large numbers like that, meaning something smaller? Is there any, what is it, just imagery then that John's portraying with this 1,000, or how would you answer that?
In a couple of different ways, and I know we're very restricted on time, but first of all, let's remember this. The number 1,000 is a threefold multiplication of a perfect number, and that's the number 10. And when you multiply a perfect number by 3 times or 7 times or 10 times, what you're doing is you're emphasizing quality, you're emphasizing nature. You're not necessarily emphasizing quantity. Now, let me illustrate this. In Revelation chapter 9, we read about this army of 200 million horses, soldiers on horses. Well, we've been told, for a long, long time, what that refers to is a, quote, imminent invasion of Israel by the Russians and the Chinese. This is supposed to be a literal invasion of Israel by a 200 million horse army. Well, here's the problem. Even today, as we're doing this program, there are only, and anybody can do this, they can look this up on Google, on Grok, on Chat GPT, doesn't matter. You will find, just ask the question, how many horses are there in the world today? At best, there are 60 million. Well, wait a minute. That's over 3 times less than what is demanded by literal reading. So what is the writer doing? By the way, many scholarly studies back this up. The ancient Hebrews, as well as others in the ancient Near East, used large numbers to do a couple of different things. When they used large numbers to speak about their enemies and the number of their enemies, they were doing that to demonstrate what a great victory it would be for God's people, who are just a little bitty handful, when they defeated them. Many scholars see that at work in the story of Gideon, for instance, back in the book of Judges. You look at this humongous number of the Midianites.
Right.
And this little handful of 600 men of Gideon. And yet he whipped them. Well, why? Well, because God gave him the victory. So what I'm saying is that in Hebraic thought, and we have a difficult time getting into that in our modern Western mindset. So what they did, and we find this also, people talk about, well, what about all these kings and that are listed in the Old Testament or in ancient Near Eastern literature, these kings that live 50,000 years. Some of them live 70,000 years. Are they trying to say that literally? No, what they're doing is magnifying the glory of this particular king, the glory of a kingdom and what have you. So they're using tremendously large numbers in order to convey glory, importance, majesty, etc., etc.
Let me see if you agree with this. I'm trying to track with your understanding. So you would say that the millennium begins at the ministry of Christ, ends at approximately 66 to 70 AD, and consummated at the second coming. And what your take would be is that the thousand there is emphasizing the fact that that time period is the most important time period of redemptive history.
Absolutely. And this is brought out by a theme that runs throughout the book of Revelation. And matter of fact, it runs throughout so many of the New Testament books. I actually had one person tell me, you must have invented this doctrine. You and William Bell invented this doctrine. Well, the doctrine is called the Second Exodus. Yeah. Well, I can assure you neither William Bell or Don Preston invented the doctrine of the Second Exodus. I have on my desk one commentator set by Peter Leithart. He is a world-renowned scholar. Okay. And he talks about the Second Exodus motif that runs throughout the book of Revelation. He's not a preterist like me, not by any stretch of the imagination. So what I'm getting at here is that in the book of Revelation, I believe that this 1,000-year reign is symbolic of the second Exodus period. And Jesus began that because guess what? Jesus was the second Moses. Hebrews chapter 3 tells us that. Only he's greater than Moses. And so Jesus was the second Moses to lead his people to the promised land of salvation. Hebrews chapter 3 and Hebrews chapter 4 draws on this second Exodus motif and lets us know that the generation of the first century was the generation of the second Exodus. And so what do you have in the first Exodus? Approximately 40 years. Some say it's actually 37. I'm not a mathematician. Anything beyond 2 + 2 = 5, I'm lost. So the point being that what I'm conveying here is that the imagery of the second Exodus permeates the book of Revelation, which gives us a clue into the fact that the timeline of Revelation is really about 40 years. We see the second Exodus in Revelation chapter 15, when John said he saw the great multitude of 144,000 standing on the seashore. What are they doing? They're singing the song of Moses, only it's not the song of Moses and Miriam now, like it was in Exodus 15. Now it's the song of Moses and the Lamb. So the Lamb, the second Moses, is the leader of the second Exodus. And so since the theme of the second Exodus permeates, I mean, literally permeates the book of Revelation, and it permeates Hebrews, and it permeates Colossians and Ephesians. But the point of it is, since it permeates the New Testament and the book of Revelation particularly, and it intersperses all of these references to the second Exodus throughout the book, then it's trying to tell us that the time period that they were in at that time was that 40-year period of time. Just like God said in predicting the second Exodus and the works therein, in Micah chapter 7, verse 15, the Lord in predicting the days of Messiah, the days of the establishment of the kingdom, the days, by the way, also of the Great Tribulation, the Lord says, according to the works which I worked when I brought you out of the land of Egypt, so I will perform those works again. Now, that's a kind of a paraphrase, but what's he saying? He performed miracles for 40 years. When they entered into the promised land, the miracles ended, Joshua chapter 5. And here is second Exodus in the book of Revelation, a 40-year period of time, anticipating entrance into what? The new heaven and the new earth.
Okay,
the promised land.
Let me establish this. So, if for somebody new, first Exodus, period of 40 years to establish the old covenant and get them into the land.
Yep.
Second Exodus, a period of 40 years where the miraculous is also present but will cease and will get us into the fully new covenant kingdom or new heavens and new earth. Now, if you're new to this, you got to go watch some other stuff. We can't explain that here, but that's your idea. And you would say that the establishment in full of that new covenant kingdom is the time of the millennium.
Yes.
Or what would you say if I said it had to be this has to be a long time? Let's talk about John 5 just for a second, where they're at the pool of Bethesda, I believe it is. There's a man that was sick for 38 years, I think is the number. And Jesus and John writes that it turns out that and says he had been sick for a long time. Would you look at a text like that to help prove your point for people who would look at maybe the parable of the virgins in Matthew 25 and other texts and say, look, he goes away for a long time, and you can't say that a long time is only 36 to 40 years.
Well, number one, we have to understand the genre of literature that we're dealing with. You know, in John chapter 5, we're dealing with a very prosaic, very historical, very literalistic perspective. This man had been blind all of his life or crippled all of his life. 38 years. Well, in a man's lifetime, that's a long time. I mean, I'm 75 now, and 38 years seems like awfully young right now. But nonetheless, one is a very historical, prosaic situation. The other is a prophetic, and here's a key, apocalyptic description. Now, that word apocalyptic, I understand it's one of those 50-cent words that is not used an awful lot. But apocalyptic generally refers to language that describes, end of time language, but it's not referring to the end of time. That is referring to the destruction of heaven and earth, in other words, but it's not literally about the heaven and earth. It's metaphoric, hyperbolic, in other words, exaggerated language that is intended to convey kind of a mental image, a mental picture. And it's not saying, well, it's literally 1,000 years. That would be a historical, prosaic statement if that's what it was trying to say. But in the context, what do we have? In the context of Revelation 20, well, we've got a pit. Could that be literal or figurative? Well, it could be literal, okay, except you got a spiritual being confined to a physical pit. Well, he's a spiritual entity. He's bound with chains. How can you confine a spiritual, non-literal, non-physical being with physical chains? And so you've got all of this imagery, all right? And it's even the imagery of Revelation chapter 21 and following of those who had been beheaded for the word of God. Well, does that mean it's only people who had been beheaded. No, the idea, those who had died
Right.
for the cause of Christ.
Yeah.
So this is the difference in genre of literature, and it behooves us as good students of the word to make a difference in our interpretation of a text that's literally physically, and it's physical and it's prosaic, literalistic, and metaphoric because of the nature of the genre of the language that's being used.
You know, another text that comes to my mind in thinking that way is when it says that Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And David had not killed 10,000 to the best of my.
He hadn't even killed 1,000.
Right. but the emphasis was on the importance of who he had killed, which would be one of them being Goliath for sure.
Yes.
So,
and we find that kind of exaggerated language found throughout all of the Old Testament, and even to a great extent in the New Testament. In the book of Judges, in the book of First Kings, what do we find? We find reference to the children of Israel, and they were as many. It doesn't say as, some passages do, but it also says they were like, or they were as the sand of the sea. Well, let's get real. And then it says they were like the stars of the heavens. No, let's get real. He's using magnified language, and he's not trying to say at all that the number of the children of Israel, or for that matter, their enemies, the Moabites on one occasion, were literally numberless as stars or sand. He's trying to convey magnitude or greatness in the case of the enemies. Look how great, look how powerful the enemies are. Oh, but wait, God's people were just a handful.
Yeah.
They destroy them. They defeat them. And so we have to understand how the ancient Hebrews thought, not the way we think. That's one of the greatest problems that we have in interpreting the Bible today. People read the Bible, and I've had people tell me, if I can't pick the Bible up and understand it just like I understand my local newspaper, I don't want anything to do with it. Well, guess what? The Bible is not like your local newspaper.
Right. Okay, let's end that there. Tell us where we can find all your information. Where can we find you on YouTube? What's your channel name? What do we look up?
Don K. Preston Morning Musings.
Don K. Preston Morning Musings.
Don K. Preston Morning Musings. I have a website, donkpreston.com. I have literally thousands of articles on there, and be looking for my book, Lord willing. I told my wife, another 2 weeks, all of my writing on my book, The Mystery of the Millennium Unveiled, all of that will be done. Then it goes through the final editing and, doing the generating of scripture index. And then I got to have some real help. But nonetheless, avail yourself of the free articles. I've written 35 books on a variety of different subjects on eschatology. They're all there. And by the way, I'll do this. If you go to my website and if you find some books that you want to purchase, if you'll mention that you saw this program, okay, depending on which books that you buy, I can't do it for the real small books because shipping is just getting crazy. But if you make an order of over $24.95, then I'll pay your shipping for you.